In this quiet, old-fashioned town of Rockdale Township, Pennsylvania, where the Amish embrace a life of simplicity, a nightmare unfolded that no one could have ever imagined. The Amish are known for their peaceful way of life, where violence is rare and murder is practically unheard of. But then came Edward Gingerich, a man who would shatter that history in the most brutal and disturbing way possible. He didn't just kill someone, he carved out his victims' organs and stacked them in a grotesque display, leaving behind a crime scene so horrifying that even seasoned investigators were shaken, and it made Edward the first recorded Amish murderer in over 200 years. Of all the cases we've uncovered, this is one that will stick with you for days, making you wonder, if Edward had been taken to a modern doctor sooner, could this tragedy have been prevented? You can let me know your thoughts once you hear the full story, because trust me, this is as tragic as the mind of the man who committed it. For starters, Edward was one of 11 children, born into a deeply traditional Amish family. When he was 18 years old, his family packed up and moved to Crawford County, Pennsylvania in 1983. Life in an Amish community is all about simplicity, faith, and following strict rules. But from a young age, Edward never quite fit the mold. While most Amish boys grew up learning farming and carpentry, Edward had an unusual fascination with machinery, something that wasn't exactly encouraged in his world. He worked at his family's sawmill, where he quickly developed a reputation as a master mechanic. He had a special talent for fixing diesel engines, something rare for someone in his community. In fact, people often said, "If something's broken, just take it to Ed. He'll fix it better than anyone else." But his curiosity didn't stop with machines. He also had an interest in the outside world, something that made him stand out even more. Unlike most Amish men, Edward started spending time with non-Amish locals, forming friendships that others in his community wouldn't dare to. One of his closest friends was Dave Lindsay, an outsider with whom he felt comfortable enough to admit something shocking. He didn't really like the Amish way of life. This was a huge deal. The Amish are taught from birth that their way of life is sacred, that the outside world is filled with temptation and sin. For Edward to openly say he didn't want to be a part of it, that was unheard of. But then Katie Shetler entered the picture. Katie was the daughter of a highly respected Amish elder, and from the start, their relationship raised eyebrows. People whispered that Katie was too good for Edward, that his rebellious nature would cause trouble. But despite the rumors, family pressure pushed Edward to propose. The Amish believe in strong, traditional marriages, and backing out wasn't really an option. So, on a rainy day in 1986, Edward asked Katie to marry him. By the spring of 1987, they were officially husband and wife. At first, it seemed like Edward was settling into married life, just like everyone expected. Katie became pregnant soon after, and before long, she gave birth to their first child, a son named Danny, after Edward's father. From the outside, it looked like Edward was on the right path, married, working, raising a family. But beneath the surface, something was changing. Edward started to pull away from his community. He became distant, withdrawn, spending more and more time alone. It wasn't just that he missed his old friendships or his interest in machinery. This was different. The once outgoing, talkative Edward was now a man who barely spoke. He avoided gatherings, lost interest in his work, and started acting in ways that confused and worried those around him. Naturally, concern for Edward grew among his family and the Amish community. But in typical Amish fashion, they chose to support him the best way they knew how, staying close, offering quiet encouragement, and hoping for the best. What no one could have predicted, though, was that Edward's detachment was just the beginning. Because by July of 1988, Edward's condition took a disturbing turn. Dizzy spells became frequent, and he was sleeping an abnormal amount, sometimes for entire days. His worried wife, Katie, reached out for help, but in their Amish way of life, modern medicine was a last resort. Instead, they turned to a trusted chiropractor, a man favored by the Amish for his natural, drug-free remedies. His solution? Toe pulling, foot rubs, and a jar of molasses. The latter meant to purify his blood. The cost? $25. Now let's be real, none of that was going to work. But Edward, desperate and with no other options, went through with it anyway. Despite multiple visits to the chiropractor and more molasses than anyone should ever have to consume, his condition didn't improve. But just when it seemed like everything was falling apart, a flicker of hope appeared. In 1989, Katie gave birth to their second son, and by 1990, they welcomed a daughter. For a moment, it seemed like life might settle down. But Edward, he was already too far gone. His presence in the family became almost non-existent. He avoided his wife and children, showing little to no interest in them. It wasn't just emotional distance. He became physically absent too, even refusing to sleep with Katie for fear she would become pregnant again. And when he did speak, it was only to mutter strange things under his breath. Things about darkness, about visions, about something coming. By the time 1991 rolled around, Edward was barely a shadow of the man he used to be. His physical health had taken a drastic hit. His once strong and capable hands now trembled with an eerie frailty. His skin had turned pale, almost translucent, and the hollowness in his eyes made it seem like he was peering into a world that no one else could see. Then, as if fate hadn't already dealt him a cruel enough hand, things got even worse. While working in his machine shop, he was exposed to toxic solvents, which only pushed his already fragile body further toward the edge. But here's the thing. The most terrifying changes weren't happening to his body. They were happening to his mind. At first, the signs were subtle, almost easy to brush off. He would mumble to himself under his breath, his words barely decipherable, just a low, constant whisper that unnerved anyone who happened to overhear. But then the whispers grew, became more urgent, more frantic. He started answering questions no one had asked, responding to voices no one else could hear. Then came the laughter, soft at first, then suddenly erupting into maniacal fits that would shake his entire body. His family would find him staring into the distance, lips moving but making no sound, his expression one of pure, unfiltered terror. But the worst was yet to come. One night, without warning, Edward dropped to all fours and began racing around the living room like a wild animal. He howled, an inhuman, guttural sound that sent chills down the spines of everyone in the house. His eyes darted around wildly as if he were seeing things that weren't there. And then, in a voice that wasn't quite his own, he started raving about giant rabbits with glowing eyes lurking in the dark corners of the house. He swore they were watching him, waiting for him. And if that wasn't disturbing enough, his ramblings took on an even darker tone. He began shouting, screaming really, about a war between God and Satan, a battle being waged for his very soul. His family could only watch in horror, unable to do anything but pray that whatever was happening to him would pass. But it didn't. It got worse. By 1992, Edward had descended into full-blown madness. His episodes became unpredictable, violent, and completely unhinged that he could no longer be left alone with his wife and children. At this point, they knew he needed medical intervention. But getting him to a hospital was no easy task. Edward resisted with everything he had, refusing to go willingly. His strength, fueled by some unseen force, was so overwhelming that his family was left with only one option. They had to hog-tie him just to get him into the car. When they arrived at the emergency room, chaos erupted. The moment they freed him, Edward snapped. He lunged at nurses, sent medical equipment flying, and thrashed so violently that it took multiple people to hold him down. The medical staff had no choice but to sedate him, finally bringing his madness to a temporary halt. Doctors diagnosed him with a severe psychotic disorder and prescribed antipsychotic medication to calm his symptoms. And for a time, it worked. The terrifying visions faded, the violent episodes ceased. but Edward hated the way the drugs made him feel. He described it as being trapped in a slow, foggy world, his body sluggish and his thoughts weighed down. He felt like a zombie, stripped of whatever was left of his identity. And so, like so many before him, Edward made a fateful decision. He stopped taking the medication. Edward's descent into madness reached terrifying depths in the early months of 1993. His mental health had deteriorated so drastically that his wife, Katie, was desperate for any kind of help. In March, she took him to see a well-respected Amish healer named Jacob Troyer, hoping for some kind of remedy. But Troyer took one look at Edward and knew that whatever was afflicting him was beyond any herbal cure or spiritual healing. His words were blunt and chilling. "Your husband has a mental problem. Take him to a hospital. I'm afraid of suicide. Goodbye, and good luck." But whether it was fear, denial, or simply the way the Amish avoided outsiders, Katie didn't take him to a hospital. Instead, the next morning, Edward was taken to a chiropractor. The chiropractor massaged Edward's scalp, gave him some liver pills, and sent him on his way. A man whose mind was on the verge of complete collapse was given a head rub and some pills meant for digestion. Edward was drowning, and everyone around him was pretending he could just float back to the surface on his own. Now, as mentioned earlier, Edward didn't have many non-Amish friends, but one of the few he did have was a man named David Lindsay. David was a born-again Christian, deeply passionate about his faith, and determined to save lost souls. When he met Edward at the sawmill, he saw him as someone who needed to be rescued. David wasn't just trying to be a friend, he was trying to convert Edward. He told him that unless he left the Amish faith and became a born-again Christian, he would go to hell. Other evangelists who visited the woodshop repeated the same warnings, pushing Edward to believe that he was trapped, that his wife, his family, and his entire Amish way of life were keeping him prisoner. Edward's mind was already fragile, but these words sent him spiraling further. His paranoia grew. The thoughts that had once been mere whispers in his mind became deafening screams, and soon he began to see his own wife as something far worse than just an obstacle. To Edward, Katie was no longer just the woman who stood in his way. She was the devil. So, on the morning of May 18th, 1993, something inside Edward finally snapped. He had been drowning in depression for months, his mind slipping further into darkness. But that day, it was different. Something evil had taken hold. The weight of his torment became unbearable, and as he stood in the kitchen, watching his wife, Katie, go about her morning, a violent storm erupted within him. Without warning, he struck. His fist slammed into her face with brutal force, sending her crashing to the ground. "I am the devil," he screamed. Katie knew she had to act fast. She turned to her 6-year-old son, Danny, saying, "Run! Get Uncle Dan, now!" Danny didn't hesitate. He bolted out the door, his little feet pounding against the ground as he raced to his uncle's house. When he got there, breathless and wide-eyed, he could barely form the words saying, "Daddy isn't well." Dan had seen his brother in dark moments before, but this time, something in his nephew's voice sent a shiver down his spine. This wasn't just another one of Edward's breakdowns. This was something much worse. He ran toward the house, hoping, praying he wasn't too late. But the moment he stepped inside, those prayers were shattered. The scene before him was straight out of a nightmare. Edward was on top of Katie, his fists hammering into her face over and over again. The sound of flesh meeting bone was sickening, and with every brutal hit, blood sprayed across the walls, the floor, even the ceiling. It was pure, unrelenting violence. Bones cracked beneath Edward's relentless assault, their sharp snaps echoing through the house like the breaking of twigs. Later, when paramedics arrived, they would say Katie's face was so utterly destroyed that she was unrecognizable. Dan wanted to stop it. He wanted to do something, but the brother he knew was gone. What stood before him was a monster, lost in pure, uncontrollable rage. Before he could react, Edward stood up, lifted his boot, and with terrifying force, stomped down on Katie's face. The crack that followed was sickening, the sound of bones turning to dust beneath his weight. Dan's stomach twisted. His mind screamed at him to intervene, but fear won. He turned and ran, bolting for help. But if you were Dan at that moment, what would you have done? Would you have stepped in, or would fear have paralyzed you? Drop your thoughts in the comments below, because the horror was far from over. Edward stood there for a moment. Then, with chilling calmness, he walked to the corner of the room, slipped on his heavy work boots, and returned to his wife's shattered body. And then he stomped again, and again, and again. Each blow crushed what little remained of her skull until her head was no longer a head, just a mess of blood, bone, and flesh. But even that wasn't enough. Something snapped inside Edward. Moving with eerie precision, he stripped Katie's body of its clothes, then walked to the kitchen. His blood-soaked hands reached for a steak knife, fingers curling around the handle as if it were just another tool in his collection. Without hesitation, he plunged the blade into her abdomen and dragged it downward, cutting through skin, muscle, and tissue. Blood poured onto the floor, thick and dark, pooling around his feet. But Edward didn't flinch, didn't hesitate. His hands disappeared inside her, and then, in a moment so horrifying it defied all human logic, he began pulling her apart. One by one he removed her organs, her heart, her lungs, her liver, her kidneys, her spleen, her intestines. Each one, dripping with blood, was carefully placed in a neat, methodical pile beside her body. It was surgical, calculated, like he was completing a task rather than committing an atrocity. When it was over, he stood up, wiped his hands on his shirt, and walked to the sink. He turned on the water, letting the deep red stain swirl down the drain, as if washing away all evidence of his monstrous act. Then, as if it were just another day, he picked up his Bible, walked over to the fireplace, and threw it into the flames. After that, Edward turned to his 4-year-old son and 3-year-old daughter, their small faces frozen in fear. In a disturbingly calm voice, he told them to put on their coats, saying they were going to their grandfather's house. Then, almost as an afterthought, he added that he would come back to burn the house down. But fate had other plans. He never got the chance. The ambulance crew had already been warned that the scene was unsafe. The call described a disturbed man, with whispers that Edward was inside, killing his wife. Assistant Fire Chief Andrew McLaughlin immediately recognized the name. He had been to the household about a year earlier and had seen Edward in one of his terrifying episodes, howling like a wild animal, cackling, spitting, and lashing out as his family and paramedics struggled to restrain him. McLaughlin had been in the ambulance with Edward that day and remembered the chilling words he had whispered. "My heart is loose. I'm drowning on the inside." This time, the emergency team braced for another violent outburst, but when they found Edward walking calmly down the road with his 2 children, he was eerily quiet. He simply told them that his father would understand. However, when McLaughlin finally arrived at the Gingerich home, nothing could have prepared him for the nightmare inside. Katie's naked body lay sprawled on the floor, her skull shattered beyond recognition. Her internal organs were carefully arranged beside her, a grotesque and chilling sight. McLaughlin, horrified, immediately radioed his crew, ordering them to call the police and keep a close eye on Edward. The brutality of the scene was so overwhelming that one of the EMTs ran outside and vomited. When the police arrived, Edward was promptly arrested. He was read his rights, but he didn't resist. Instead, he freely admitted to killing his wife, as if it was a simple fact. At the station, officers ordered him to remove his boots and coat for evidence. As he did, a piece of flesh fell from his boot, a sickening reminder of what he had done. Even in custody, lost in his delusions, he muttered to the officers, For some reason, I think we could still save her. It was only after his arrest that doctors finally diagnosed Edward with paranoid schizophrenia. A name was finally given to the illness that had tormented him for so long. But the diagnosis had come far too late. Too late to save Katie, too late to undo the horror he had unleashed. Neither the prosecution nor the defense ever disputed that Edward Gingerich had killed his wife. The evidence was clear, the crime undeniable. However, the argument was never about whether he did it. It was about why he did it. His attorney, Donald Lewis, painted a harrowing picture of a man trapped in the grips of severe mental illness, unable to comprehend reality, let alone his own actions. Edward pleaded not guilty by reason of insanity, a claim backed by chilling accounts of his deteriorating mental state. Edward had begged for help again and again to his father, to his wife, to his brothers. He spoke of the unbearable headaches that tormented him, of his growing fear that God had abandoned him, and of the dark presence he believed had taken hold of him. He was desperate, spiraling, but no one understood the true depth of his suffering. No one realized the horror that was coming. His wife, Katie, had lived in quiet submission, as was expected in their Amish community. She was a devoted mother and wife, but her husband was becoming more erratic by the day. Even as Edward's mind crumbled under the weight of his delusions, the Amish way of life rejected modern medicine. Instead of psychiatric care, he was treated by a chiropractor who, for 6 months, massaged his scalp and gave him molasses. Hours before Katie's death, that same chiropractor had treated Edward again, completely unaware of the monster brewing beneath his troubled surface. Then, it happened. Edward's psychosis reached its breaking point in the most horrific way imaginable. When the fog lifted, Katie was dead. The brutality of the murder shocked even the most hardened individuals. But was it the act of a cold-blooded killer, or was it the tragic consequence of untreated mental illness? In the year 1994, Edward was convicted of involuntary manslaughter, but mentally ill. He was sentenced to 5 years in the prison ward of a mental hospital. The Amish community and the public at large were outraged. Many believed this sentence was far too lenient for such a horrific crime. Mental health professionals and even members of his own community feared what would happen once Edward was released. Yet, there were others who took a different view. Some of Edward's fellow Amish saw his punishment as just, arguing that modern medicine had restored his sanity. They believed he was truly remorseful, that he deserved the opportunity to repent, and that with proper guidance, he could return to the community. Some even offered to take him in, pledging to supervise him. Against public outcry, Edward was released in the year 1998. He was placed in an Amish mental care facility in Michigan, but after an unspecified incident, he was transferred to an Indiana psychiatric unit designated for Amish individuals who required constant supervision. Still, he longed to return home. He wanted to see his children. He wanted to rebuild his life. Eventually, Edward moved back to Crawford County, but the life he had once known was gone. Though 2 of his brothers and his teenage sons had reconciled with him, the rest of the Amish community had not. Edward was shunned, cast out, forced to exist on the fringes of his former life. In the Amish world, shunning isn't just rejection, it's erasure. To be shunned means you are seen but not acknowledged. You are there, yet you do not exist. His teenage daughter, Mary, was placed in the care of her grandparents and was forbidden from seeing him. Anyone who dared associate with Edward risked being shunned themselves. Even his children, innocent as they were not spared. Tensions ran so high that when some of the children attempted to attend a youth prayer meeting, they were arrested for defiant trespass. In April of the year 2007, Edward's desperation reached new heights. He and his sons orchestrated the kidnapping of his 17-year-old daughter, Mary, in a last-ditch attempt to reclaim a piece of the family he had lost. According to an affidavit from Mary's aunt, Clara Gingerich, Mary and Clara had been traveling in a horse-drawn buggy when Edward's brother, Dan, suddenly leapt onto the wagon, seized the reins, and redirected them toward another Gingerich brothers' property. As they neared the barn, Mary's brother grabbed the horses, leading them inside, where Edward and his other brothers were waiting. Surrounded and outnumbered, Mary was given an ultimatum: leave willingly with her father, or the police would force her to go with him. Convinced she had no choice, she went. For 5 days, Mary was missing. To many in the Amish community, the nightmare was repeating itself. A vulnerable young woman was in the hands of the same man who had murdered her mother. Some feared that Edward had suffered another psychotic break, that history would repeat itself in blood. When Mary was finally found, safe but shaken, Edward faced legal consequences once again. However, his punishment was shockingly light. He pleaded no contest to concealing the whereabouts of a child and was sentenced to just 6 months of probation and a $500 fine. Despite regaining contact with some of his family, Edward remained an outcast. He could never fully return to his old life. For an Amish man, exile was a punishment far worse than prison. It was social death. Edward struggled with his guilt for years. He was haunted by the reality that his family could never fully embrace him without risking their own place in the community. His depression deepened, and he became more isolated. His mental state, once stabilized, began to decline once more. Then in the year 2011, nearly 2 decades after the murder of Katie Gingerich, Edward took his own life. He had been living with his attorney for 6 months. One day, the attorney's wife went out to the barn and found Edward's lifeless body hanging. He had left behind only one final message, scrawled in the dust on top of a bucket: "Forgive me, please." In a twist of irony, Edward was finally welcomed back into the Amish community after his death. He was buried beside Katie in an Amish cemetery, a gesture of reconciliation that sparked just as much controversy as his life had. Some saw it as an act of mercy, a way to finally grant him peace. Others saw it as an insult to Katie's memory. Despite their differing views, the Amish community gathered from far and wide to attend the funeral. They stood together in grief, offering support to Edward's brothers and sons. Now that he was gone, his family was no longer outcasts. They could return. They could belong again. And so, the tragic chapter of Edward Gingerich finally came to a close. As you probably already know, the Amish are known for their simple way of life, rejecting modern conveniences and relying on their faith to guide them. But in Edward's case, their rejection of modern medicine may have sealed his fate and that of his wife. Had he received proper psychiatric care instead of natural remedies, Katie might still be alive. So, what do you think? Could this tragedy have been prevented if they had just taken him to a hospital? Was this a case of untreated mental illness, or was something more at play? Drop your thoughts below. I'd love to hear your take on this. If you like the way we create these videos, and you want to help bring more cases like this to light, hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives. Thank you once again for watching.